The first keeper hired to be at Long Island Head was a man named Jonathan Lawrence. He was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was wounded at the Battle of Fort Erie. They say a gunshot grazed his head, went through his shoulder and out his back. And it was not unusual for a wounded war veteran to get a lighthouse keeping appointment. That was a fairly common thing after the War of 1812, especially after the Civil War. There are actually quite a few wounded war veterans who got lighthouse keeper appointments as a favor after the Civil War. There are even quite a few who had one arm and some who had one leg. That's kind of hard to believe, but there were a number of one-legged lighthouse keepers after the Civil War.
Now, I first met Jeremy. He actually worked at WGBH in the archives, remember?
It's a couple of lifetimes ago, but I do remember.
And you were one of the first, if not the first, projectionist at the IMAX Theater.
At the Museum of Science, yeah. I was one of the original staff in 1987 of the Mugar Omni Theater. Yeah.
And I'm mentioning that because his passion is lighthouses. And it's really a thrill to see how when somebody has an avocation, they parlay that into their life's work. So Jeremy had these jobs, but he loved lighthouses. Now today he's a celebrated author and a historian and a lecturer. And his partner Charlotte, I remember many an evening we would be having supper in Winthrop because we collaborated on a video documentary about Boston Light back in the late 1980s. It was called Boston Light, Past, Present, and Future.
As Suzanne mentioned, I've been doing lighthouse stuff for a couple of years, or 30-ish years, somewhere around there. And you know, I fell in love with the beauty of lighthouses, but the thing about lighthouses that has always held my attention, the thing I like to talk about the most and write about the most, is the human history, the stories of lighthouse keepers and their families. And luckily for me, there's no end to these stories. It seems like every lighthouse, if you look into it deeply enough, you will find absolutely endless stories about life at the lighthouses. As Suzanne mentioned, not all of the lighthouses in Boston Harbor had families. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Tonight, I am going to touch on every lighthouse that has existed in Boston Harbor. This is an old chart of the harbor from a couple of hundred years ago. And you can see the lighthouse locations in red there. Graves Light, way up there. There are 7 locations, and we only have 3 lighthouses left out of those 7 locations. Graves Light, Boston Light, and Long Island Head Light. All these other lighthouses are gone now. And in those 7 locations, as has already been talked about, we had 11 standing lighthouses at one time. There was a brief period from about 1903 to 1913 when there were 11 lighthouse towers standing in Boston Harbor. Actually, that's not quite right. 1905 to 1913, there were 11 standing lighthouses in the harbor, and we've lost all but 3. So we've lost a lot of our lighthouse heritage in the harbor, but we need to hang on to the history. I think it's extremely important that we record the stories of keepers as much as we can. So tonight I am going to touch on all of those lighthouses. Again, not all of them had families, but the ones that didn't have families I'm going to talk a bit about as well. So this is a picture of Boston Light I took from a helicopter. Oh, by the way, at the beginning of my talk, the first thing I meant to say was it's nice to be here on the 300-year and 1-day anniversary of Boston Light. I forgot to say that. So happy birthday, Boston Light. It is on Little Brewster Island, of course, at the entrance to the harbor, at what used to be the entrance to the main shipping channel into the harbor, much closer to the town of Hull than it is to Boston. You can see the Boston skyline in the upper right there in the distance. I took this from a helicopter in 2001. That was a very memorable day. I'll talk a little bit more about that helicopter trip a little bit later. Everybody knows, of course, that Boston Light was established on September 14th, 1716, 300 years ago yesterday. It was established, of course, by order of the colonial legislature. They passed the Boston Light Bill. And the very first lighthouse keeper on the North American continent was a man named George Worthylake, hired by the colonial government. He was 43 years old. He moved to the island with his wife and their youngest 2 daughters. They had 5 children, also a family servant named George Cutler, and 2 slaves, Shadwell and Dinah. I wish we knew more about the slaves that were at some of the early colonial lights. Unfortunately, we know next to nothing about them. By the way, George Worthylake had lived on George's Island in the harbor before he became the keeper, but George's Island was not named for him or his father, who I think was also named George. It was actually named for John George, the Boston merchant, who was the one who submitted the petition to the legislature to get the lighthouse built. So there's a couple of connections of George's Island to Boston Light. But anyway, so George Worthylake moved to the island with his family and served the servant and slaves in September 1716. He was paid very little. His original pay was 50 pounds a year, which was considered a very low salary at that time. He complained until he got a raise to 75 pounds in his second year, but it was still kind of a pathetic salary. So he had to do extra things to make a living to support his family. He served as a harbor pilot. He would greet incoming vessels, help them into the harbor. He was paid for that. He also briefly tried having a flock of sheep, which turned out very badly. He had a flock of 59 sheep. They wandered out on the sand spit from Little Brewster Island at low tide one day. And from your reaction, probably don't have to finish that, but the tide came in, and unfortunately that was the end of his flock of sheep. So poor George Worthylake just couldn't catch a break, basically. In November of 1718, Worthylake went to Boston with his wife, one of their two daughters, and the family servant, George Cutler. They went in on a Sunday. They attended church in Boston that Sunday. They stayed overnight, and on Monday morning, he picked up his pay in Boston. They continued. Then they came back toward Boston Light, traveling in a sloop, probably similar to the vessel you see in this picture here. And they picked up a family friend at Lovells Island. They continued back to Little Brewster, and they anchored off of the island. Shadwell, the slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party, and as Worthylake's other daughter and a friend were watching from the island, they were coming back to the island. Nobody knows for sure why this happened. There was not a storm going on or rough seas from all accounts, but the canoe capsized, and all 6 in that canoe drowned. This is a pretty famous event, remains one of our worst lighthouse tragedies in American history. This is the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake, not far from here in the north end in the Copp's Hole Burying Ground. And a little footnote to this, it was carved by a young man who subsequently married the Worthylake surviving daughter. Just a little interesting note there. But anyway, big front page news of its day. Cotton Mather, the famous minister in Boston, preached a sermon about this. Benjamin Franklin, 12 years old, living in Boston at the time, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy. And his brother printed copies, and young Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 12, hawked copies of The Lighthouse Tragedy on the streets of Boston. The second keeper who went out to replace Worthylake, Robert Saunders, also drowned 2 weeks later. He was with another man. They went out to meet an incoming vessel. Their boat capsized. Actually, I believe there were 3 men in the boat. 2 of them drowned, including Saunders, and people started to wonder if the island was cursed. But there were no tragedies involving keepers at Boston Light for a long time after that. I am going to come back to the later history a little bit later, and I'm afraid there is one more tragedy I'm going to have to mention. But I'm going to move on to Long Island Headlight. Long Island Headlight was established in 1819, and as Suzanne mentioned, it has been rebuilt 3 times. So the lighthouse we have today, this 52-foot brick tower, is actually the 4th lighthouse at Long Island Head. This is a 19th century engraving. I think the height of the bluff at Long Island Head is exaggerated a little bit there, but it's still a really neat engraving. You can see Boston Light in the distance over here. The first lighthouse was just a short stone tower, and the first keeper hired to be at Long Island Head was a man named Jonathan Lawrence. He was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was wounded at the Battle of Fort Erie. They say a gunshot grazed his head, went through his shoulder and out his back. And it was not unusual for a wounded war veteran to get a lighthouse keeping appointment. That was a fairly common thing after the War of 1812. Especially after the Civil War. There were actually quite a few wounded war veterans who got lighthouse keeper appointments as a favor after the Civil War. There were even quite a few who had 1 arm and some who had 1 leg. That's kind of hard to believe, but there were a number of 1-legged lighthouse keepers after the Civil War. Anyway, Jonathan Lawrence became keeper, the first keeper at Long Island Head. I don't know anything about his family life. He probably had a family, but I haven't been able to find anything about that. He had the extra job for a while there was like a mast near the lighthouse, and it had black signal balls on it. And it was part of his job to hoist these signal balls. When a ship was coming into the harbor, he would hoist one of those balls. It was like a notification to the harbor pilots that a ship was coming in. They would go out and meet the incoming ship when they saw those signals. Also, in 1821, Lawrence rescued 3 men from drowning. There was a sailboat on a Sunday afternoon sailing near the island. It overturned. 2 men quickly drowned. The other 3 were hanging on to the overturned boat for their lives. Lawrence went out and pulled them into his boat, rescued them, took them back to the keeper's house. I have a news clipping about that, and it says that they would have been dead a few minutes later. And it also says, basically, let this be a warning to you to not go sailing for pleasure on the Sabbath. They were kind of chastising everybody that wasn't a proper thing to do. But it's one of many, many rescues carried out by lighthouse keepers over the years. They were usually on the lookout for people in trouble. As Suzanne mentioned, the lighthouse was rebuilt 3 times. The 1844 lighthouse, as she mentioned, was the very first cast iron lighthouse in the United States. It didn't last all that long. It was replaced in 1881. I don't know if any of you know there's a lighthouse on Lake Champlain in Vermont called Juniper Island Lighthouse near Burlington that looks pretty much identical to that 1844 tower. It was built 2 years later, and that is now the oldest surviving iron lighthouse in the country. It was rebuilt in 1881 as a more standard cast iron lighthouse, one that we're sort of more used to that style, kind of similar to the Noble Light up in York, Maine, and Nobsco Light on Cape Cod, and a number of other ones. And they built this really pretty keeper's house at that time with the gingerbread trim and everything, built at the same time. It was rebuilt again in 1901. The lighthouse shared Long Island Head with Fort Strong, and it had to be rebuilt in 1901 because they had made changes in the fort. The lighthouse was basically in the way, so they had to relocate the light station. And you can see in this early 1900s postcard that the island was basically devoid of trees at that time. It's incredible how different it is compared to how it looks now. I'll show you a picture of what it looks like now in a minute. This man, Edwin Tarr, seen here with his wife and daughter, was earlier an assistant keeper at Thatcher Island, the Thatcher Island Twin Lights off of Rockport, Mass. And while his father and brother were also keepers, while he was on Thatcher Island, he met and apparently fell in love with and married a traveling school teacher, which is not an unusual thing to happen. On some of these lighthouse islands, if they had enough children at different times, they would send traveling teachers who would stop at the island, give the kids their lessons for the next few weeks, come back a few weeks later, give them their homework, and they would, check up on them every few weeks. I've read many accounts of the traveling teachers meeting and marrying sons of keepers or assistant keepers, that type of thing, not unusual. So Edwin Tarr married the teacher who's on the left there. I forget her first name, but anyway, they moved to Long Island Headlight in 1906, where he became keeper. The only keeper at Long Island Headlight. It was one of those places that just had one keeper. And they had a daughter, as you see here. Edward Rowe Snow, and I should hesitate for a second and tell people who Edward Rowe Snow was. I'm sure a lot of you here know who he was. Edward Rowe Snow, certainly Suzanne and I were very much influenced by him. Suzanne knew him quite well. He was the master chronicler of Boston Harbor and really the New England coast. He wrote many, many books about maritime history, especially New England. He was from Winthrop, born in Winthrop in 1902, later lived in Marshfield, and I could go on and on about Edward Rowe Snow. It's hard to put in just a few words, but a really big personality who really inspired a lot of people, and I'm going to say a little bit more about him later. But anyway, in a couple of his books, he wrote about Edwin Tarr. He said that Edwin Tarr died at Long Island Headlight in 1918, early in the year in winter, while sitting in a chair looking out at the harbor, which I always thought was a very poetic way for a lighthouse keeper to die. I guess he had a heart attack. So people gathered on the island for a funeral. They held a funeral in the keeper's house, and it was a cold winter day. The ground was icy. Some of the men carried the coffin out of the house, and they were carrying the coffin down the steep hill down to a waiting boat so they could take it to the mainland for burial. As they were doing that, at least one of the men, probably one slipped first, but anyway, they slipped on the ice, dropped the coffin on the ice. The coffin went sliding down the hill. The men jumped onto it trying to stop it, and according to Edward Rowe Snow, they rode the coffin like a toboggan all the way down the hill, and it stopped just short of going into Boston Harbor. So complete disaster was just barely avoided, but Edward Rowe Snow immortalized that kind of macabre story. This is what Long Island Headlight looks like today. I took this picture just earlier this summer, and you can barely see the lighthouse for the trees there. All the other buildings have been destroyed many years ago. The keeper's house is long gone, so only the lighthouse tower stands there. Of course, access to Long Island Head is extremely problematic these days. The public can't get there. I don't know when that'll be happening again, but hopefully in the future there'll be access. The lighthouse is still active, still an active aid to navigation, so the Coast Guard maintains the light, but the lighthouse is owned by the National Park Service now. It's actually considered part of the Harbor Islands National Park. Has an LED light these days. This is Bug Light, which we talked about, officially Narrows Light, and this is the only lighthouse of its type that ever existed in the Northeast. Many lighthouses like this were built, especially in Chesapeake Bay and off North Carolina, there were some. It's basically a cottage-style lighthouse on these iron piles. The piles were driven deep into the bottom of the harbor, and obviously the keepers and their family, the keeper and his family lived in the upper part of the lighthouse, in the cottage. And as Suzanne said, there are a number of lighthouses nicknamed Bug Light. This seems pretty obvious to me why it got that nickname, though. You almost, you could imagine it just walking away on the sand spit there. It kind of looked like a big bug or spider. This is a map showing its location. It was at the end of a long sand spit extending out from Great Brewster Island. Here's Boston Light. There's a sand spit extending down here to the entrance to the Narrows Channel, the channel between Lovells and George's and Gallup's Island, and the Narrows Light is at the end of that sand spit. Edward Rowe Snow wrote about some of the keepers at Bug Light. One was Gershom Freeman, and this is a neat picture at low tide. You can really see the spit in that picture. Edward Rowe Snow wrote that Keeper Freeman had a housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Tenney, and Edward Rowe Snow actually interviewed her. And she had a son who lived with her at the lighthouse. Her son Francis would row his boat from Bug Light every day to George's Island and on to Boston so he could go to school. If the weather or seas were too rough, he would stay at George's Island until things improved. The housekeeper was in Bug Light for the famous or infamous Portland gale of 1898, right around Thanksgiving in 1898. Named for the steamer Portland, which sank in that storm out in Massachusetts Bay with about 200 people on board. And Mrs. Tenney said that during that storm, the stones were striking the legs of the lighthouse and sounded like strange music, as every leg had a different pitch. This is a very sad picture here. A man by the name of Tom Small, who was one of 3 lighthouse keeper brothers. His brothers were Arthur and Judson Small. Tom Small was the keeper at Bug Light for several years in the 1920s, from about 1922. And in 1929, on June 7th, 1929, he was near the end of a project where he was removing paint from the outside of the lighthouse with a blowtorch, which sounds kind of crazy, but I guess it was not an unusual thing to do. But this particular day was very windy, and a spark from the blowtorch basically ignited a fire very quickly in the roof of the lighthouse, and it was up in flames within minutes. A fireboat came out from Boston, but it was far too late. Tom Small, the keeper, managed to throw some of his belongings into a rowboat. He escaped as things were falling around him, including the fog bell, which you can see up here. The bell fell and reportedly narrowly missed him as he escaped. So he was lucky to be alive, basically. And that was the end of the lighthouse. For a while, these structures were there. Some of the base of the old lighthouse was still there. There was a skeletal tower with an automatic light and an electric fog bell on the location as well. But that's all long gone now. All that's there now is this very nondescript steel skeletal tower with an automatic light on it, which still stands today. Just a reminder that there was once a lighthouse with people living in it in that location. The next lighthouse to be established in the harbor was Deer Island Light in 1890, and it was located just off the tip of Deer Island, which we talked about a little earlier, about the island, which is attached to the town of Winthrop. This is a type of lighthouse that people often refer to as a spark plug type light. Kind of looks like a spark plug. It's also called a caisson light. The lower part, the cast iron caisson, was bolted firmly to the harbor bottom there. In some cases, they would sink those caissons really deeply into the bottom. Filled with concrete, and there was storage for oil and water on the upper part of the caisson. And the keepers lived in the superstructure, the cast iron structure up here. There was a galley, a kitchen, and then a couple of floors of bedroom space in there. This was basically a males-only station, so families, for the most part, didn't live here, although certainly family members spent time at the lighthouse. This man was actually one of the longer-serving keepers at Deer Island Light. It was not a terrible place. It was fairly close to the mainland, but it was still an offshore lighthouse and kind of a rough place to live in winter. It was not considered a great assignment. So Wesley Pingree, his service of 6 years there, was one of the longer keepers at Deer Island Light. He was an assistant for a couple of years and then head keeper for 4 years until 1899. He was interviewed by Edward Snow later on, and he was at the lighthouse at Deer Island Light during the Portland gale of November 1898. Pingree said, quote, "At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ocean was smooth as glass. At 5 p.m. it had started snowing. The wind was coming up. At 7 p.m., the steamer Portland came down the channel, and the other boat, anchored in President's Road," he's talking about another steamship, "whistled a warning to her. At this time, the waves were hitting so high that I was lashing my dory fast to the light," unquote. So Pingree rode out the storm at the lighthouse, and the damage wasn't too bad at the lighthouse. He was fine. But he may have been the last, or certainly one of the last people to see the steamer Portland afloat before it sank way out in Massachusetts Bay. The ship was located about maybe 20 years ago now, by the way, much farther away from Cape Cod than people previously thought it was. But all told, 141 vessels were wrecked in the Portland gale and 456 lives lost. One of the worst storms in New England history. This is not a good picture. This is the only picture I have of Joseph McCabe, who was an assistant keeper at Deer Island Light from 1908 to 1916. And this is a very sad story. I always tell people, lighthouse keeping wasn't as romantic as you think. And if you dig into the history of almost any lighthouse, you're likely to find tragedy in there somewhere. But especially at the offshore lighthouses, you're likely to find at least one tragedy. And this was a very sad story. On February 19th, 1916, Joseph McCabe left the lighthouse to meet his fiancée, a woman named Gertrude Walter of East Boston. They met on Deer Island to fill out their wedding invitations together. When he was ready to leave the island to go back to the lighthouse, he found that his boat was frozen in the ice and he couldn't get it free. So he decided he would walk on the sand spit. At low tide, it was possible to walk on a sand spit from Deer Island to the lighthouse. So he left with his friend Wesley Pingree, the former keeper, and Pingree's son, 15-year-old son. And as McCabe went to kind of jump across a gap in the sand spit, at one point he slipped. He was wearing rubber boots. He slipped and went into the waters of the harbor. It was very rough water that day. And the Pingrees called for help. A boat came out from the sewage treatment plant at Deer Island, but it was too late, and Joseph McCabe drowned. He was 28 years old. And what makes it especially poignant is I believe that the wedding invitations were actually mailed that he had just filled out with his fiancée. So people received the invitation only to find out what had happened to him. So very, very sad story. On a lighter note, in the 1930s, Tom Small, who I was talking about at Deer Island at Bug Light, the last keeper of Bug Light, he went on to be the keeper at Deer Island Light for some years in the 30s. And that is his wife in this picture. They had a cat. I don't know the cat's actual name, but the cat was immortalized as the climbing cat of Deer Island Light. This cat would dive into the water. He would get a fish in his mouth, or maybe it was a her, I'm not sure, and would climb back up the ladder and eat the fish. And I remember Edward Snow's wife, Anna Merle Snow, who I got to know when I was making some videos about Edward Snow. She told the story of the cat, and she told it in the way that she would tell a group of kids. She used to speak to children pretty often, and I remember she said, and the cat would dive into the water and catch a fish, a small fish, but a fish nevertheless, would climb up the ladder and eat the fish. I can always hear her telling the story in my mind. Anyway, so this is a pretty famous cat. There were at least a couple of other fishing cats. There was a very famous one at a lighthouse on the Providence River down in Rhode Island, Tommy III, who was famous for catching lots and lots of fish. Here's a later picture of Deer Island Light. I'm skipping ahead to its last days. I should make it clear that the keepers, the Coast Guard took over the management of our lighthouses in 1939. Before that, it was generally referred to as the Lighthouse Service. It was under the Treasury Department, later the Commerce Department. Keepers were civilian employees of the federal government, but after 39, it was the Coast Guard. The last keeper of Deer Island Light was a man named Pedro Marticio. He emailed me a few years ago and told me exactly what happened at the end of his time at the lighthouse. He said that on February 19th, 1972, at 6:30 p.m., the station was officially abandoned. There was a terrible storm going on, a nor'easter. He said that all power was lost, the engine room was flooded. There were 3 men in the lighthouse, 3 Coast Guardsmen at the time, and I'll read what he said. Quote, "The Coast Guard cutter Pendant was dispatched to shoot us a line and pass us a pump. When Bosunmate Chief John Butler, officer in charge of the Pendant, saw the tower starting to tip, he informed Boston, and in turn they told me to abandon station. The Pendant rammed its bow into the tower, and my crew and I jumped on board. When he backed into deep water, he got broadsided by a wave that almost capsized the 65-foot tug." By the way, the Pendant, the boat he's talking about there, is still in active service at the Point Allerton Coast Guard Station in Hull. Anyway, this was the end of Deer Island Light as a staffed light station. A short time later, they officially automated the light. The tower stood for about another 10 years, but by that time it was in just horrendous shape, so the Coast Guard decided to dismantle it. Excuse me, it was torn down in 1982 and replaced by this, I would say, to put it kindly, nondescript fiberglass pipe tower, which stood until early this year. I'm sure a lot of you remember this tower, but that is now gone. It was replaced early this year by this even more nondescript steel skeletal tower. So this is now Deer Island Light next to the base of the old lighthouse out there. So I guess that's progress, but I won't say any more about that. This is a postcard from the early 1900s of Spectacle Island. This is, to me, a great postcard because it actually shows the 4 light towers at Spectacle Island, the 2 sets of range lights. In 1897, 1 pair of range lights was established, and that's the lighter colored ones here. The front light is here, the rear light is here. And let me just make it clear what range lights are for people who might not know. If you're in a shipping channel, and if you have range lights, which are quite common, you would have a front light and a rear light. The rear light is always behind and above the front light. So as you're coming up in the channel, you want to line up the front light in front of the rear light with the rear light above the front, directly above the front light. When you have those lights perfectly lined up, you know you're right on the channel. So range lights have been commonly used in this country and other countries for a very long time. They established in 1897 the 1 pair of range lights at Spectacle Island for 1 shipping channel, and then in 1903 they established the Broad Sound Channel range lights to mark the Broad Sound Channel, the primary channel into Boston Harbor that was improved in the early 1900s. So for a brief time you had 2 sets of range lights. The original 1897 lights were discontinued in 1913. They felt they weren't really needed anymore. But the Broad Sound Channel range lights remained in use until about 1950. It's my understanding they burned down a few years later in a fire that I think did quite a bit of damage on the island. But anyway, it's very unusual. I don't know of any other case with such a small island where you had 4 lighthouse towers standing for a brief time. These are the 1903 Broad Sound Channel range lights. It gets really confusing trying to research the history of these lights because these Broad Sound Channel lights are often referred to in documents as the Spectacle Island range lights. So sometimes it's hard to tell which set they're talking about. But anyway, you can see there are wooden towers. The rear one was about 50 feet tall. The front one was about 30 feet tall. And you see the keeper's house, a rather large keeper's house back here. There were quite a few people living on the island. And Billy Hargreaves, who for a while she was the daughter of the supervisor of the landfill for a while, she said that her family had dogs and cats to control the rat population. But she also said that the children were taught to shoot the rats, and they kept a running score. This man, John Lelan Hart, who had previously been a keeper at Boston Light, was keeper at the Broad Sound Channel range lights for about 12 years until 1938. This is a picture from the time of his retirement. He was a long-time lighthouse keeper and was at sea before that. He spent many, many years at sea. But in the newspaper when he retired, it said that although he had spent his life on the sea or near it, he never really enjoyed it. So, you know, most lighthouse keepers, even though it was a tough job in many ways, and it didn't pay all that great, you didn't get rich being a lighthouse keeper, but they generally found things to love about it. He's an exception, and you have to give him points for honesty, I would say. The Lovells Island range lights were also established in 1903. You can see they look very similar to the 1903 range lights on Spectacle Island. There were wooden towers, and there was like a wooden walkway or trestle thing that you would walk between the two lights above the wet ground there. By the way, this oil house, this little building here that was used to store kerosene for the lights, still stands. It's the only part of the old light station that still stands, minus its roof. That building is still standing out there, but nothing else remains from that light station. This is Alfred Eisner, who was the first keeper of the Lovells Island range lights. He was kind of a character. He was from Maine. He wrote poetry, and he self-published a booklet of his poetry. This is an example of one of his poems. Mayhap there'll come a future day when we shall want no more, and old AG will be content with what he has in store. The office then will have to do without the usual rhyme that the old man would peddle out at almost any time. I thought that was pretty good. So I have a feeling he had a really good sense of humor. A newspaper report said that in 1911 said, quote, "The house faces the water of the main ship channel, and Mrs. Eisner keeps it as presentable as the lenses of the revolving light." So it was a nicely kept station. So they were there for 16 years, and then when Alfred Eisner retired, Charles Jennings became the keeper. Anybody know who the other man? This is Charles Jennings on the left, and you know who this other man is? I'm sure some of you know. That's Edward Rowe Snow, who we've been talking about. That's an early picture. So a lot of you probably remember him in later years when he had a big mop of white hair. This is back in the 1930s when he still had dark hair. And he was good friends with a number of the lighthouse keepers in the harbor. Charles Jennings had been keeper at Boston Light. He was also at Monomoy Point Light before that. Started his career at the Thatcher Island Twin Lights. And here's Harold, their son. Charles and his wife had a son born 2 years after they came to Lovells Island. And Harold was just a great guy, as Suzanne said. And as she mentioned, he wrote the book A Lighthouse Family, which has a lot of great stories about life on Lovells Island. This is just a couple of excerpts here. Harold recalled that the family had a large garden, which was typical for a family light station. If they had the room for it, had the land and the soil, they would have a big vegetable garden. They also frequently had animals, and the Jennings family was no exception. They had chickens, ducks, and turkeys. The turkeys were a variety called Bourbon Reds that were bought through the poultry section of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Harold had very fond memories of Christmas on the island. His father would make handmade toys, and Harold years later had a handmade lighthouse and a battleship. And he said that his father made him a barge one year. It had thread spools and drums to coil ropes on. Spools that were supposed to be drums for ropes, and the derricks went up and down. A joy, he said. And I had the distinct pleasure of taking tours on a couple of occasions with Harold Jennings on Lovells Island, walking tours of the island. Suzanne was part of those tours too. This was circa late 80s, I would say. I think it's before 1990. Yeah, late 80s. So these were shot with a VHS camcorder. The quality of the video you're going to see here is not great, but I want you to get a feel for Harold Jennings and the way he told stories. So I'm going to play 3 brief clips of Harold Jennings. This first one is Harold talking about swimming on Lovells Island.
Now the sun's on the sand. When the sand comes in, the water is usually warm. And if we did any swimming, that's when we did it on a day like this. Otherwise, you didn't swim. You turned blue in 5 minutes. Cold. Waters are cold out here. And friends of mine used to come and say, "Oh, you're lucky you live on an island. You can go swimming." Well, I say, go ahead and find out.
This next clip is Harold talking about attending school during his years at Lovells Island.
See, I went my first grade in Hull, then my second grade in South Boston, third grade in Eaton Boston, fourth grade in Salem, and fifth grade on the island here. We had a private teacher. But I hated that because I could hear my father moving around and I could hear the boats going by and I was distracted.
And this is Harold talking about the part of Fort Standish, the fort on Lovells Island. There's a tunnel there that goes, I guess, way underground and goes towards the water. And Edward Rowe Snow used to bring groups of kids down into that tunnel. So here's Harold talking about that tunnel.
They were hinged on each side. You were open, they creaked like a, the old mysteries, So they go in, and you go in about 10 or 15 feet, and then you make a right-hand turn, and you go for about another 10 or so feet, and it goes down, here, and it goes down and right out to the waterfront, right out on the beach. You used to be able to see the dome on it, out there on the beach. Well, Edward Rowe Snow was, come on with me, come on. We'd be squatting down like this, and he'd have the light, and he'd put the light out, and us kids would scream. It was spooky on there.
He was just a great guy. And before I move on to Graves Light, let me just say that Harold Jennings actually served as the official last keeper of the Lovells Island Range Lights. His father fell ill in 1939, and Harold, who was 18 at the time and had basically learned how to take care of the lights from his father, quit high school, again at the age of 18, and served briefly for the last, I think, just few months that the Lovells Island Range Lights were in operation. He was the last keeper there. The lights were deactivated in 1939. Eventually all the buildings and the lighthouses were torn down, as I said, except for that little oil house. Graves Light was the last light in the harbor to be established in 1905. It is on these ledges at the entrance to the Broad Sound Channel into the harbor. You can see the Boston skyline directly over the lighthouse there. And of course you can see Graves Light from many points on shore, especially from Winthrop and Nahant and Revere and a few other places, and Hull from the other side. It was built over a couple of years, 1903 to 1905. It is basically in the tradition of the great wave-swept granite lighthouses of the world. Lighthouses like Eddystone Light in England and Minot's Ledge Light off the south side of Boston Harbor down off Scituate and Cohasset. It's made of these massive granite blocks that are dovetailed into each other, basically with a system of hooks and notches, so they're really locked into each other. Also iron dowels and very strong mortar. So, this lighthouse was really built to last. Some of these structures, the other structures here, this walkway and the wharf here, were pretty much washed away over the years. This little oil house over here still stands. You can see the foghorn at the top of the lighthouse up here. It was originally there. So this was always a males-only station. Families did not live in Graves Light. It was an early 1900s postcard. And one of the early keepers complained that it was like living in a tube. One of the keepers at Minot's Light quit because he said he couldn't stand round walls anymore. So life at a lighthouse like this was certainly not for everybody. They would generally assign 3 keepers to a lighthouse like this. There would be 2 out there at one time. One would be on shore leave. So you might get 2 weeks on, a week off. It changed at different times. It might be as much as 24 days off and on and 6 days off, that sort of thing. So, and in winter, you might be stuck on there a lot longer than you had been scheduled to be there for. You might not be able to get to shore for several weeks at a time or more. Elliot Hadley was the first keeper, and in 1910, he said, quote, "I've looked up at solid water rushing in toward the ledges. I don't know how far up the solid water comes. I've been knocked down on it by the wharf beside the light, and opening a window to look out more than halfway up the tower, I've had as much as 3 bucketfuls dashed in my face." The lighthouse is 113 feet tall, and I think the window he's talking about, he said more than halfway up the tower. It's got to be at least this one, maybe that one, but he's talking probably at least like 50 or 60 feet up in the air. This one is not quite as exposed at Minot's Light. Minot's Light, which is about the same height, at times has had waves hitting it and just going right over the top of it. I never seen pictures of Graves Light like that, but I've seen some pretty huge waves at Graves Light. This is from 1935. This is Edward Rowe Snow right here. He's only about 32 years old in this picture, very young Edward Rowe Snow. He was always holding commemorations and ceremonies and things, recognizing different events, different anniversaries. So he held a 30th anniversary celebration of the lighting of Graves Light, October 1st, 1935. He's giving a certificate here to Octavius Remy, who's the man right here. He was the head keeper at the time. His father, Milton Remy, had been a keeper at Minot's Light. The man holding his hat here on the left is Maurice Babcock Sr., the longtime keeper of Boston Light, came over for that event. And these are pictures from 1945 taken by the great Boston area photographer Arthur Griffin. I'm sure some of you remember that name. He did like a photo essay on the keepers, the Coast Guard keepers at Graves Light. And this keeper on the upper left is inside the huge lens. Graves Light had a first order Fresnel lens. I don't have time to get deeply into Fresnel lenses. I'm sure a lot of you know Fresnel, named for Augustin Fresnel, the French engineer who invented them in 1822. Made of multiple prisms that basically focused and magnified the light into a powerful beam. Graves Light had the largest kind made, a first order lens, which is around 9 or 10 feet tall. And with the largest lenses, the keepers would actually get inside them to service the light, to clean the inside of the prisms and so forth. So this keeper is inside the lens, and that is an incandescent oil vapor lamp, a kerosene-operated lamp he's working on there. And that lens, sadly, when the light was automated in the 1970s, that lens was removed and crated up at the Smithsonian in Washington. It remains crated up. It's never been on display. That's kind of a sad thing. Before I tell about this, let me just say a little bit more about the automation of Graves Light. In the mid-70s, Pedro Marticio, who I mentioned before was the last keeper at Deer Island Light, was also the last keeper at Graves Light. He emailed me. He said that there was a problem with mercury fumes. That huge lens used to rotate on a mercury bed. Mercury was a really good bearing, so a lot of the rotating lenses used mercury. And he said the fumes from that mercury bed were affecting the Coast Guard keepers out there and making them sick. So that was part of why the Coast Guard automated the light in the mid-1970s and removed the keepers. And they also removed the lens and put in new equipment at that time. I visited Graves Light in June 2001 with a Coast Guard friend, Dave Waldrop, and the pilot, Dale Hardy. This is Dale here. We landed in this little helicopter on this little postage stamp-sized platform on the side of the lighthouse, which was a very interesting experience. He set it right down with no problem at all, but I don't know if you can make it out, but the tail is sticking way off the edge and the rotors, it's that landing place was a lot smaller than the helicopter, basically. Anyway, then we went up the 30-foot ladder up the lighthouse into the doorway to get inside. And this is a crew that was solarizing the light at that time, converting it to solar power. Almost all our offshore lighthouses are now solar powered. We used to have an underwater cable, but those cables are very expensive over time to maintain. They break easily. So almost all these lighthouses, the offshore lights, have been converted to solar power. And many of them have been converted to very simple modern LED lights. This one has not yet gotten an LED. So I'm going to just talk for the last part of my talk about the more modern era at Boston Light. This is Maurice Babcock, who was keeper from 1926 to 41. He was a native of the northern Maine coast. He had been at the Thatcher Island Twin Lights as an assistant, and he became a really highly respected keeper at Boston Light. He's inside the second order Fresnel lens here. You can see the flash panels. These round flash panels are bullseye panels that create the flash as the light rotates. If you're out in the water, every time one of those flash panels passes between you and the light, that's what creates the flash. And he is working on the IOV, or incandescent oil vapor lamp there. Very finicky lighting apparatus. Probably one of my favorite periods of Boston Light history is the 1930s and 40s. At that time, you had 3 keepers and their families living there, and as many as 19 kids living on this tiny little island that, putting it generously, maybe 2 acres at low tide. How big would you say? Is that about right, more or less? Less than that, from less than 2 acres at low tide. Hard to imagine 19 kids living there, but Maurice Babcock and his wife had 5 kids, I believe. The Norwoods, this family, Ralph Norwood in the upper right there, and his wife Josephine, had 9 kids. And another assistant named Ted Haskins also, I believe, had 5 kids. So that adds up to 19. Maurice Babcock Jr. told me that when all those kids were out there, everybody pretty much got along great. But he said people were sometimes kind of territorial. And he said that one time he wandered onto the Norwoods part of the island without permission, and one of the Norwood girls socked him in the nose. But mostly they got along. He also said they would play games with children on the other islands. Great Brewster Island had a cottage colony for a while in the summer. There were lots of people around the harbor in the summer. And they would play baseball on Great Brewster Island. He said, Maurice said, and the water was out, and the games didn't last very long. But they found ways to have fun. Again, you can see the Norwoods and their 9 kids here. They had 9 kids by the time Josephine Norwood was 27 years old, by the way, which she certainly deserved a medal for that. But this is later when they were at Ram Island Light up in Boothbay Harbor. This is a quote from Josephine Norwood. She said, "As we never knew when inspection of the houses, tower, and fog signal would be held, it was a matter of course to have the beds made, the dishes done, and the sweeping and dry mopping done by 10 o'clock. Of course, our children were brought up to help with the work. And then they had their time to swim, go fishing, walking over the bar at low tide, or go rowing." So they, again, they found ways to have fun. They would have rowboat races with the children on the other islands and pie eating contests, go fishing a lot, and so forth. The kids in this era did not live year-round at the Lighthouse. They would board with families on the mainland to go to school, and they would spend the summers on the island, and sometimes school vacations and weekends, but especially the summers were just a glorious time for these kids. Here's a picture of the 5 of the Norwood clan on the old fog signal, the old fog cannon at Boston Light. This was actually the first fog signal in North America. It was put on the island in 1719 so that the keeper could answer ships in the fog. If a ship fired a cannon, they would fire powder in the fog if they couldn't see anything, and the keeper would actually fire some powder from this cannon as a signal so the mariners could have some idea of where they were by hearing that. But anyway, it's still on display inside the base of Boston Light today. This is a quote from one of the Norwood kids. "I've never been in another place that felt like the home Boston Light was," Bruce Norwood. I had the pleasure of meeting several of the Norwood grown kids. They were grown by the time I met them. One of the brothers, and I can't think of which one it was, but one of the Norwood brothers told me that he hated every minute of it. But most of them found a lot to like about it, but island life is not for everybody, so there's always going to be exceptions. The first child born at Boston Light in its long history was in 1932, Georgia Norwood, born to Ralph and Josephine. In April 1932, there she is with her father on the left there. And I'm going to play you a video clip of Josephine Norwood. She lived to be about 100. She just died a few years ago after having those 9 kids by the time she was 27. And this was 1991 at Boston Light. We had a kind of a reunion event that Suzanne and I organized. And I'm going to play you a clip here of Josephine Norwood talking about the birth of her daughter.
April the 11th, 1932.
And what happened on April 4th? A week before?
A week before, well, I thought she'd be born then, and she wasn't. It was just
False. But it was a
false
stormy night,
labor
wasn't it?
pains, yeah. And the doctor tried to land, and of course he couldn't on account it was a storm and real bad weather. So he had to turn around, go back to home. But the next week she was born, everything was okay. There was
Storm child.
yeah, storm child. The author Ruth Carmen, she had written other books, and she heard about Georgia and wanted to write a life story and have her in the movies. And I had other children. I couldn't just pick out, and I wouldn't let them have Georgia. So she would have taken it to Hollywood, but it wasn't for her. Maybe she thinks differently now, but I couldn't part the family.
Because it made newspaper headlines, they called the child the storm child because of the doctor going out there in the storm. And Ruth Carmen, a novelist at the time, wrote this book, Storm Child, loosely based on the story of Georgia Norwood. The only true thing in the book is that she was born on the island. Nothing else in the book is true. In fact, the climax of the book has a tidal wave destroying Boston Light. So, as Josephine was saying, some people in Hollywood wanted to make a movie out of Storm Child. They were going to have Georgia play herself. She was played up as the Bay State's own Shirley Temple. And the story goes that the night before she was going to fly to Hollywood, Georgia was crying. She said, "I don't want to go to Hollywood. I want to stay at Boston Light." So she never went, and the movie was never made, which I don't know if it would have been good exactly, but it's too bad the movie wasn't made. George's son, Willie Emerson, wrote this book. I have a copy of First Light as well, about 30 years ago. It's hard to believe it's 30 years ago now, but he wrote the book First Light. It's a very interesting book about his family's experiences at Boston Light. It's kind of hard to find now, but if you search used book dealers, you might be able to track down a copy. Willie lives up in the Boothbay Harbor area now. I mentioned before that the first two keepers of Boston Light drowned, and I mentioned that it was a long time between tragedies, but sadly there was another tragedy in 1952. This man, Richard Fredey, I found out that is how his family pronounces the last name, Fredey, was a young Coast Guardsman, 22 years old at the Lighthouse. He was one of the Coast Guard keepers there in 1952. And in November of 1952, he left in one of the station's small boats to go to Hull along with a contractor, a 53-year-old man named Wilford McNeil. They were last seen in Hull around 3:30 a.m. on November 21st, 1952. They then started back to the island, but by late the next morning, it was realized that they hadn't made it back. A search party went out. McNeil, the contractor, his body was later found, but Richard Fredey's body was never found. He was 22 years old. He left a wife and a 6-month-old daughter. And this is Richard Fredey with his baby daughter, Jill, at Boston Light here. I'm going to say a little bit more about Jill Fredey in just a minute here. In the late 80s, Boston Light was due to be the last lighthouse in the country to be automated, and the Coast Guard keepers were going to be removed. Dennis Dever here, I got to know well because I was helping to give tours some of the time with the Friends back in the late 80s. And I interviewed Dennis at the top of the lighthouse in 1989, so I'm just going to play a real brief clip here of Dennis.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window, just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
He loved being a lighthouse keeper. He thought he was going to be the last lighthouse keeper in America. As it turned out, legislation was passed, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, to keep a human presence at Boston Light. So they had Coast Guard keepers out there for years until 13 years ago, when a civilian keeper was hired, as Suzanne's already talked about, and I think you probably all know anyway. Sally Snowman is the keeper. She has been for 13 years. In the lower right here, by the way, this is Sally with a woman named Connie Small, who I knew quite well. Connie was the author of a book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, which I recommend really highly. Connie and her husband Elson lived at lighthouses in Maine and New Hampshire for 28 years. Lighthouse Keeper's Wife is a wonderful book. Connie lived to be 103. This was a short time before she died in 2005, and when I arranged for Sally to come and visit her in Portsmouth. So that was a nice get-together there. Sally is the only official lighthouse keeper in the United States today. It's not the traditional job. The light is automated. It's on 24 hours a day. But Sally oversees tours. She oversees the staff of 90 volunteers, Coast Guard auxiliary volunteers, known as watchstanders. So it's still a very important job. And she's the only, sometimes other people refer to as lighthouse keepers, but in most cases they're more like caretakers these days. Sally's a real lighthouse keeper, still employed by the federal government. This is just from last month. Early last month, I had a group trip out to Boston Light, and these people were all there that day. It was pretty neat getting these people together. On the left is Barbara Keyser, who was the granddaughter of a lighthouse keeper named George Keyser. He was at Boston Light as an assistant for several years in the early 1900s. He was then at Plum Island Light in Newburyport for a long time. There's Sally. There's Jill Fredey, the baby you saw being held by her father, Richard Fredey, at the lighthouse in 1952. Her father drowned in 1952. Jill had not been on the island since she was a baby. This was her first time on the island, and it was emotional for her. And it was nice, helping to make that happen. And Diana Capiello is a descendant of Maurice Babcock, the longtime keeper of Boston Light, the last civilian keeper of Boston Light. So this was kind of a unique photo op there, I'd say a pretty special day. And that brings me to the end here, and some sources of information if you want to look up more online. And do we have maybe a couple of minutes to take questions if people have any questions?
Beacon Hill was named after the fact that they used to have beacon fires on top of the hill. Did that precede the lighthouses?
Yes. Yes, but I believe it was just like signal, like warning, a warning beacon or signal tower rather than not for navigation. So it wouldn't be referred to as a lighthouse or an aid to navigation. It was more of a signal tower.
Graves Ledge Light has that very distinctive diamond pane on the curved glass. Of all the lighthouses I've ever seen, it's the only locale, at least in our area, that I've seen it. How frequently does the treatment of a lantern room get to look like that? It's
kind of unusual. There are a few others, not many that I can think of off the top of my head, but Ram Island Ledge Light up near Portland Headlight is almost a twin of Graves Light, so it has the same lantern, the same design. It's just a little bit shorter, but they're almost like siblings. I think Rockland Breakwater Light in Maine has diagonal panes as well, diamond-shaped panes. It's fairly unusual, but it's just an architect's preference, I think. I've never seen anything in writing about why they would do that as opposed to just simple astragals,
Can we have a round of applause? Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Let's say you have to put a highway through, and you've got 50 miles of highway coming up to an archaeological site, and you have 50 miles going in the other direction. You have a 100-foot section that has a 19th or 18th or 17th, you name it, site sitting right there. You don't always have that option to say, oh, well, just have a nice little jump in the highway right here. So you have to do something to get that site recorded, and that's where the data recovery comes in.